The first thing I heard inside that courtroom wasn't the judge's voice. It was my husband leaning close enough that only I could hear him. "You lost." He didn't say it with anger. He said it like a conclusion, like a man reading the final line of a story he thought was already finished. His breath was warm against my ear, confident, almost bored. I didn't turn to look at him. I didn't need to. From my left, his mistress let out a small laugh. Not loud, not embarrassed. The kind of laugh that assumes permission. The kind that says the room belongs to her now. Behind them, his family sat in a neat row, relaxed, smiling. One of them crossed their legs. Another checked their phone, as if this were a formality they were simply waiting to get through. No one looked worried. No one looked unsure. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't react. The judge opened the file. Paper shifted. Pages turned slowly, deliberately. The sound carried farther than it should have, slicing through the quiet. The room seemed to lean forward without moving. My husband straightened in his chair, already preparing for what he believed would come next. His lawyer leaned in to whisper something reassuring. The judge didn't speak. He read in silence. Seconds stretched, then more seconds. Long enough for impatience to creep in. Long enough for my husband's confidence to flicker, just slightly, before settling back into place. He had no reason to doubt this moment. None of them did. I realized then that they didn't understand what this case was actually about. They believed the story they had written for me. That was the moment I understood why they were smiling. And why they were wrong. Everyone in that room thought they knew exactly who I was. To them, I was the wife who had stayed quiet too long. The woman who had let decisions happen without pushing back. The one who had watched her marriage unravel and arrived at court with nothing but hope and nerves. I could feel their eyes on me, measuring my posture, my stillness, waiting for the cracks to show. They expected tears, or anger, or panic. They got none of it. What they didn't see was the weight pressing down on my chest. Not fear, exactly, something heavier. The understanding that this room was about to decide more than the end of my marriage. It was about reputation, financial survival, the right to speak for myself after months of being spoken over. The visible narrative was simple. My husband had already won. He looked the part, calm, prepared, flanked by a lawyer who spoke smoothly and a woman who carried herself like she already belonged at his side. His family sat behind him like a wall, solid and unyielding. Together, they formed a picture of certainty. And then there was me, alone. No stack of documents in front of me. No whispered strategy session. No reassuring hand on my shoulder. I had arrived with very little, at least on the surface. I knew how that looked. I knew how often women like me were dismissed in rooms like this before they ever opened their mouths. I let that assumption stand. The judge adjusted his glasses and continued reading. Still silent, still focused. I watched my husband glance toward his lawyer again, the smallest crease forming between his brows. The mistress stopped smiling, her attention snapping back to the bench. I felt it then. The shift. Subtle, but unmistakable. The power in the room had not settled where they thought it had. I didn't look at my husband when he exhaled sharply, irritated by the delay. I didn't acknowledge the way his confidence began to press outward, filling the space as if daring the judge to hurry up and confirm it. I stayed exactly as I was. Still, attentive, unremarkable. They thought my silence meant I had nothing. What they didn't understand was that silence in a courtroom can be a choice. I knew what I stood to lose if this went the way they expected. The house I had lived in, the stability I had built my adult life around, the ability to walk away without starting over from nothing. They had counted on that fear. They had built their confidence on it. They assumed I would break before the judge ever spoke. The judge finally looked up. Just once. Just long enough for his eyes to pass over the room, over the lawyers, over my husband, and then rest on me. There was no expression there, no warmth, no judgment, just attention. Something in my husband's posture tightened. I felt the weight of every decision that had brought me here. Every moment I had stayed quiet when speaking might have felt easier. This courtroom wasn't the beginning of my story. It was the end of a long process they hadn't even noticed was happening. They believed this was where my life narrowed. They had no idea it was about to open. They thought this was the moment I lost. They didn't know it had started years earlier, back when I first learned how easy it is for people to underestimate a woman who isn't trying to prove anything at all. The courtroom wasn't where my story began. It was where it ended. Years earlier, before lawyers and whispered threats, before anyone decided who I was allowed to be, I had a life that was entirely my own. My name is Claire, and at the time I met my husband, I was 30 years old, living in a quiet neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon, working as a compliance analyst for a regional logistics firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was precise work: rules, procedures, documentation, systems that only worked when every detail was accounted for. I liked that kind of order. I wasn't looking for marriage. I wasn't lonely. I had friends, routines, a small apartment I'd furnished myself, and a steady sense of who I was. Stability mattered to me more than excitement, and I'd learned early that charm without consistency was just noise. I met Daniel on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in a place so ordinary it almost feels intentional now. A cafe near the courthouse, one of those places where people go to wait out obligations they can't avoid. He was sitting at the table next to mine, reading through a thick folder, frowning slightly as if the papers had personally offended him. We didn't flirt. We didn't exchange witty lines. He asked me if the chair across from me was taken. That was it. He spoke calmly, confidently, the way people do when they're used to being listened to. He told me he worked in property development, that he spent most of his time dealing with contractors, city permits, and negotiations that went nowhere. I told him what I did, and he nodded with polite interest, but didn't ask many questions. At the time, I mistook that for respect. Our early dates followed the same pattern: predictable, comfortable, dinner at reasonable hours, conversations about long-term plans instead of weekend thrills. Daniel talked about building something solid, about legacy, about wanting a partner who understood discretion and loyalty. I thought we were aligned. When he proposed less than a year later, it didn't feel rushed. It felt logical. My friends said I seemed calm about it, almost too calm. But I took that as a compliment. I didn't want fireworks. I wanted a life that didn't collapse under pressure. His family approved quickly. That should have been my first clue. They described me as sensible, steady, easygoing. His mother hugged me tightly and said I would fit in beautifully. His sister told me Daniel needed someone grounding, someone who didn't challenge him unnecessarily. At the time, I thought that meant they trusted me. We married quietly. No spectacle, no drama. I stepped into my role naturally, handling the things Daniel didn't want to think about: schedules, social obligations, emotional smoothing. I noticed problems before they became conflicts and adjusted before anyone asked me to. That became my habit. Daniel liked to say I was low maintenance. He said it affectionately, as if it were a rare quality. I accepted the label without thinking too hard about what it implied. Over time, I learned to anticipate his moods, his preferences, the way he liked things done. I didn't see it as shrinking myself. I saw it as cooperation. Marriage, I believed, was about knowing when not to push. What I didn't realize was how quickly cooperation becomes expectation. From the outside, we looked balanced. He handled the visible decisions. I handled the invisible ones. Friends admired our stability. His family praised my flexibility. I was never dramatic, never demanding, never the kind of woman who raised her voice in public. That was the version of me everyone accepted. What no one noticed was that I had stopped being asked. Decisions began to happen around me instead of with me. Plans were announced instead of discussed. Daniel would say things like, "I already took care of it," or "There was no need to bother you with that." I smiled and nodded, telling myself this was what partnership looked like when one person had more on their plate. I didn't argue. I didn't interrupt. I didn't insist on explanations. They mistook my restraint for ignorance. The truth was, I noticed everything. I noticed when conversations shifted the moment I entered the room. I noticed when Daniel spoke for me instead of to me. I noticed when his family stopped asking what I thought and started assuming they already knew. Once, during a discussion about a future investment, Daniel confidently explained something incorrectly. It was minor, but I knew it was wrong. I opened my mouth to correct him, then stopped. He sounded certain, and no one questioned him. I stayed quiet. Later that night, he thanked me for not embarrassing him. That was when I first understood how useful my silence was to other people. I had built a reputation as someone who didn't complicate things, someone who went along, someone who could be trusted not to disrupt the narrative. That reputation followed me everywhere, settling into place until it became the lens through which everyone saw me, including Daniel, including his family, including eventually the woman they would tell me not to worry about. At the time, I believed I was choosing harmony. I believed compromise was a sign of maturity. I believed that love meant knowing when to step back. What I didn't know was that I was teaching them exactly how far they could push before I disappeared entirely. By the time I realized the rules had changed, I had already helped them believe I would never challenge them at all. The opportunity arrived quietly, tucked into an email I almost deleted because I assumed it was another routine update. It wasn't. A former supervisor reached out about a compliance leadership role opening at a national firm expanding on the West Coast. The position came with authority, autonomy, and a compensation package that would have changed my financial footing entirely. It would have meant travel, visibility, and a seat at tables I had only supported from behind the scenes. For the first time in years, something felt like it belonged to me alone. I didn't tell Daniel right away. Not because I was hiding it, but because I wanted to understand how I felt before it became an us conversation. I reread the message that night, imagining what it would look like to step into a role where my judgment wasn't secondary, where my silence wasn't assumed. When I finally told him, I framed it carefully. I explained the opportunity, the timing, the uncertainty. I expected questions. Daniel listened, nodded, and smiled in a way that felt reassuring at first. "That's impressive," he said. "Really impressive." Then he leaned back and added, "But this probably isn't the best moment." He didn't say no. He didn't have to. He talked about stability, about how much pressure he was under with his current projects, about how unpredictable things could become if both of us were stretched too thin. He talked about the future, about how much easier it would be once his next development phase was complete. "Just wait," he said. "Give it a little time. We'll revisit it." He made it sound temporary, reasonable, loving, even. I wanted to believe that. Over the next few weeks, the conversation resurfaced in smaller ways. He mentioned how grateful he was that I was flexible, how not everyone understood the importance of timing, how lucky he felt to have a partner who didn't need constant validation. Each time, the window felt like it narrowed a little more. When the firm followed up, asking for a formal response, I declined. I told myself there would be other opportunities. I told myself that supporting Daniel now would pay off later, that partnership meant making sacrifices when necessary. I didn't see it as giving something up. I saw it as investing. That was the first unequal exchange. Almost immediately, my days began rearranging themselves around his needs. My schedule bent more easily than his. My work became something I did quietly, around the edges of his priorities. When he needed help reviewing documents or preparing for meetings, I stepped in without complaint. No one called it unpaid labor. It was just what wives did. Daniel's achievements became shared victories. Mine became footnotes. When friends praised his success, they looked at me with approval, as if my role was simply to nod at the right moments. I smiled, because smiling was easier than explaining something I couldn't fully name yet. Money entered the conversation soon after. Daniel suggested simplifying our finances. Joint accounts, consolidated access, fewer unnecessary complications. He framed it as efficiency, as trust. I agreed without asking for detailed breakdowns. I didn't insist on oversight. I had no reason to suspect anything at the time. Or so I told myself. I noticed small things first. Statements arriving later than usual. Conversations about investments that seemed to happen without me. When I asked, Daniel reassured me smoothly, explaining that he was handling the details so I wouldn't have to worry. "You hate this stuff," he said. I didn't correct him. It was easier to let the assumption stand. His family became more involved around then, offering advice that sounded helpful but carried an edge I couldn't quite place. His sister talked about long-term planning as if it were already decided. His mother mentioned future arrangements without asking how I felt about them. I told myself this was normal. Families had opinions. Boundaries took time. One afternoon, I overheard part of a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Daniel was on the phone in his office, the door half closed. I caught my name, followed by a phrase that made my stomach tighten. "She doesn't need to be involved in that." The door clicked shut before I could hear more. That night, Daniel slid a document across the table and asked me to sign. He explained it quickly, confidently. I scanned it, noticing how little it said about my role and how much it assumed his authority. My pen hovered for a second longer than usual. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded and signed. At the time, it felt like trust, like choosing harmony over friction. Looking back, I can see it for what it was. A moment where I handed over leverage without understanding its value. No one forced me, no one threatened me. That's what makes it harder to explain. The power didn't shift with an argument or a betrayal. It shifted with consent, given too freely and without enough questions. I had loved Daniel. I believed in the version of us he described so convincingly. I believed patience was a virtue, that timing mattered, that sacrifice would be reciprocated. What I didn't realize was how closely sacrifice and erasure can resemble each other when you're not watching carefully. By the time I sensed something was off, the balance had already tipped. Decisions were no longer shared, they were delivered. My role had become supportive by default, advisory at best. And somewhere in that quiet rearranging of my life, someone else was paying very close attention. I just didn't know it yet. Her name entered our life so casually that I barely noticed it at first. Daniel mentioned her over dinner one evening, between a comment about zoning delays and a complaint about a contractor who never returned calls. "Elena suggested an alternative," he said, reaching for his glass. "She's sharp, really knows her way around these things." I asked who Elena was, expecting the answer to be brief and unimportant. "She consults sometimes," he said, "helps streamline decisions. It's nothing you need to worry about." The phrase landed oddly, but I ignored it. People worked with consultants all the time. I told myself I was reading into it. Over the next few weeks, her name surfaced more often. Elena thought this. Elena recommended that. Elena agreed with Daniel's instincts. She seemed to exist everywhere without ever appearing, a presence established entirely through repetition. When I finally met her, it was under circumstances so neutral they felt deliberate. Daniel invited her to join us for coffee after a site visit, framing it as convenience. Elena arrived exactly on time, dressed simply, confidently, as if she already knew the rhythm of our lives. She smiled politely, shook my hand, and thanked me for making time, as though I were a secondary participant in my own marriage. She spoke easily, not loudly, and never interrupted. She addressed Daniel directly, referencing past conversations I hadn't been part of, finishing his thoughts before he did. He deferred to her without hesitation, nodding as she spoke, letting her guide the conversation. I watched it happen without comment. Nothing she did crossed a line. That was the problem. There was no moment I could point to and say, "This is wrong." Just a series of small things that added up to a feeling I couldn't justify aloud. After she left, Daniel asked what I thought. "She seems competent," I said carefully. "She is," he replied, relief softening his voice. "I knew you'd understand." Understand what, exactly, he didn't say. From then on, doubt was handled gently, expertly, like a fragile object that needed to be put away. When I asked about decisions that seemed rushed, Daniel smiled and told me I was overthinking. When I pointed out changes in schedules or priorities, he reminded me how stressed I'd been lately. "You've always been sensitive," he said once, not unkindly. "That's one of the things I love about you, but this is all professional." I began editing myself before I spoke, measuring my tone, softening my questions. I didn't want to become the suspicious wife, the one who saw threats everywhere. His family helped with that. Daniel's sister mentioned Elena during a family dinner, praising her insight and how much she had taken off Daniel's plate. His mother smiled and said it was nice he finally had someone who understood the demands of his work. "Of course, Claire does too," she added quickly, the correction too fast to be sincere. Conversations began stopping when I entered rooms. Plans were discussed elsewhere, then relayed to me as conclusions. I was still included, technically. I just wasn't centered anymore. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and found Daniel and Elena standing closer than necessary, laughing softly over something on his phone. It was an ordinary moment, innocent enough to dismiss. But the way he looked at her lingered just a second longer than it should have. When he noticed me, he stepped back immediately. "You okay?" he asked, as if the question itself proved his innocence. "Fine," I said, forcing a smile. Later that night, he brought it up before I could. "I hope you're not feeling uncomfortable about Elena," he said. "I'd hate for you to misunderstand things." The implication was clear. If I felt uneasy, that was on me. I chose silence again. I told myself trust required restraint, that reacting without proof would only make me look insecure. I swallowed the feeling and let it settle somewhere deep, where discomfort often goes to wait. At home, my position continued to shift. Decisions were already made by the time they reached me. My role became smoothing edges, absorbing tension, keeping the peace while others moved freely. I worked harder to maintain harmony even as I felt myself slipping further out of the frame. One evening as I passed the hallway, I overheard my name spoken in low voices behind a closed door. "She'll come around," someone said. Elena's voice, calm, certain. Daniel murmured something I couldn't hear. I stood there longer than I should have, heart pounding, waiting for a clarification that never came. When the door opened and they noticed me, the conversation ended instantly, smiles returning as if nothing had happened. I didn't confront them. I didn't demand explanations. I told myself there was still no proof, just a growing sense of displacement I couldn't yet name. But something had changed. The ground beneath my marriage felt less solid, as if weight was being redistributed without my consent. I wasn't being pushed out. I was being edged aside, carefully, politely, in ways that left no marks. At the time, I believed I was protecting my marriage by staying calm, by refusing to make accusations I couldn't defend. What I didn't understand was that every time I stepped back, someone else stepped forward. And soon, what I stood to lose would no longer be abstract or emotional. It would be measurable. The first number that didn't make sense appeared on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. I was paying bills at the kitchen table, coffee cooling beside me, sunlight cutting across the floor in familiar patterns. I logged into our joint account the way I always did, without suspicion, without urgency. I wasn't looking for anything unusual. The balance was lower than it should have been, not dramatically, not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to make me pause. I refreshed the page, checked the date, ran the numbers in my head again. Maybe a payment had processed early. Maybe I had forgotten a transfer. It was easy to explain away a single discrepancy, and I did exactly that, until it didn't resolve. Later that afternoon, I checked again. The number hadn't changed. Neither had the unease settling in my chest. I pulled up recent transactions, scanning them slowly, line by line. A transfer I didn't recognize. Another coded vaguely, labeled as an internal adjustment. I closed the laptop and reminded myself to breathe. That evening, I asked Daniel about it casually, the way you ask about something you're already prepared to accept an explanation for. I mentioned the balance, my confusion, the odd transfer. He didn't hesitate. "Oh, that," he said easily. "I moved some funds around temporarily. It's just for liquidity, nothing to worry about." He smiled when he said it, confident and calm, as if the matter were already settled. He explained it quickly, using language that sounded technical enough to discourage follow-up. He told me it was all part of streamlining, of keeping things efficient. "You hate dealing with this stuff," he added gently. "I'm just trying to spare you the stress." I nodded. I even thanked him. Relief and unease coexisted uneasily, but relief won the first round. I didn't want to be paranoid. I didn't want to be the woman who questioned every movement of money as if trust were optional. So I let it go. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more small shifts. Statements arriving later, notifications rerouted to Daniel's email instead of mine, conversations about finances that ended before I realized they'd begun. Whenever I asked, I received reassurance instead of answers. "It's already handled. There's no need to revisit that. You don't need to worry about this anymore." The words sounded comforting. They were meant to. But slowly, something unsettling became clear. I no longer knew where all our money actually was. The realization didn't hit all at once. It crept in through patterns. The timing of transfers that coincided with Elena's increased presence. The way Daniel referenced decisions as if they were collective, even when I had no memory of being consulted. Then his family began to normalize it. At a weekend gathering, his sister casually mentioned a financial arrangement I knew nothing about. She spoke as if it were common knowledge, as if I were simply out of the loop by choice. "Daniel's taken care of that," she said brightly. "You're lucky you don't have to worry about money like the rest of us." Someone laughed. I forced a smile. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Questioning finances wasn't curiosity, it was ingratitude. Later, his mother joked that I must be enjoying being free from the burden of details, that it was nice for Daniel to shoulder responsibility so completely. The implication hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. I began doubting my right to clarity. The moment I realized I was being managed came quietly, without confrontation. I tried to access a shared document one afternoon, something I'd reviewed dozens of times before. The password didn't work. I assumed I'd mistyped it and tried again. Locked out. When I asked Daniel about it, he looked surprised, then thoughtful. "Oh," he said. "I updated the access. It was getting messy with multiple logins. I figured I'd keep everything centralized for now." "For now," I repeated. "It's easier this way," he said, already moving on. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my thoughts finally sharp enough to cut through the fog I'd been living in. This wasn't efficiency. It wasn't protection. It was control, wrapped in concern and sealed with trust I'd given too freely. Something inside me shifted. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't demand my access back. Outwardly, I accepted the explanation with the same calm I'd always shown. Internally, I stopped explaining things away. I began remembering details, dates, phrases, the way conversations ended abruptly when I entered rooms, the way Daniel's confidence grew in direct proportion to how little he thought I was paying attention. I started keeping copies, screenshots saved quietly, notes written down and tucked away. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Just enough to make sure my memory didn't blur with time or doubt. What struck me most was how certain they all were that I wouldn't check, that I wouldn't question, that I wouldn't notice what was being rearranged right in front of me. They believed my silence meant safety. In reality, it meant focus. Money changes the nature of betrayal. Love can be rewritten, reinterpreted, dismissed as incompatibility. Finances leave a trail. Numbers don't care about narratives. They either add up or they don't. And these numbers didn't. By the time I understood that the money wasn't just moving but leaving, I knew this wasn't mismanagement or coincidence. It was preparation. Pieces being positioned, exits being planned. I didn't know yet how far it went or who else was involved. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever future was being built, I was not meant to be part of it. The conversation that changed everything wasn't meant for me to hear. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that passes without leaving a mark. I was in the hallway, folding laundry, when Daniel's voice drifted from his office. The door was partially closed, his tone low and controlled. At first I didn't listen. I had learned how to tune out what wasn't directed at me. Then I heard my name. I paused, a towel clenched in my hands, my body going still before my mind caught up. Daniel was on the phone, speaking with the kind of certainty he used when decisions were already made. He wasn't arguing, he wasn't negotiating, he was confirming. "I'll handle the timing," he said. "She doesn't need to know yet." The word yet echoed louder than anything else he said. I told myself I had misunderstood. That context was missing. That I was filling in gaps with fear. I waited for him to clarify, to laugh, to correct himself. He didn't. Instead, he continued, calm and deliberate, mentioning dates that didn't align with anything we'd discussed. He referenced steps, logistics, outcomes. Not possibilities. Outcomes. My hands started shaking. I moved away quietly, my heart pounding hard enough that I worried he might hear it. I finished folding the laundry on autopilot, my thoughts racing ahead of me, replaying every conversation from the past few months with new clarity. The distance, the financial shifts, Elena's increasing presence, the family's sudden confidence. It all rearranged itself into a pattern I could no longer ignore. This wasn't a marriage in trouble. It was a marriage being exited. That night, Daniel came to bed late. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, my body rigid with the effort of staying still. I didn't ask questions. I didn't confront him. I listened to his breathing slow as he fell asleep, already comfortable in a future I wasn't meant to share. The next confirmation came days later, wrapped in politeness and pretense. Daniel's mother called in the middle of the morning, her tone light, almost cheerful. We talked about nothing for a few minutes, the weather, a mutual acquaintance. Then she said casually, "Once everything is settled, you'll probably want to think about next steps." Next steps. I asked her what she meant, keeping my voice neutral. "Oh, you know," she said smoothly, "when things change, it's important to be prepared." She didn't say divorce. She didn't need to. The call ended shortly after, and I sat there staring at my phone, the final pieces clicking into place. This wasn't just Daniel's plan. It was coordinated, discussed, agreed upon. I had been the only one not invited into the conversation. Looking back, I could hear it now in their past words. Advice that felt like instruction. Reassurances that sounded like positioning. Every moment where I'd been encouraged to stay calm, stay flexible, stay quiet. They hadn't been soothing me. They had been managing me. Denial ended that day, not with a scream or a breakdown, but with a clean, brutal clarity. I understood then that reconciliation was never on the table. Silence had been mistaken for consent. Patience had been interpreted as compliance. There was nothing left to fix. I grieved quickly and quietly. Not for the man Daniel had become, but for the marriage I thought I was in. The version of us I had believed in so thoroughly that I'd ignored my own instincts. Once the grief settled, something else took its place. Focus. I stopped asking questions altogether. I stopped seeking reassurance. I stopped trying to be understood by people who had already decided who I was. Instead, I watched. I listened more carefully to the way conversations shifted when I entered rooms. I noted how often Elena's opinions were referenced as conclusions. I paid attention to language, to phrasing that revealed more than it intended to. I realized they believed I still didn't know. That belief made them careless. They spoke freely around me, confident that my silence meant ignorance. They continued planning, adjusting timelines, discussing logistics. I became invisible in a way that was both painful and strangely liberating. I understood then why confronting Daniel would have been a mistake. Anger would have warned them. Questions would have triggered defenses. Emotion would have confirmed their narrative that I was unstable, reactive, unprepared. I wasn't any of those things. I chose to wait. Waiting didn't mean doing nothing. It meant observing without interference. It meant letting patterns reveal themselves fully. It meant allowing them to continue underestimating me. Fear still surfaced, especially at night, when the house was quiet and the future felt dangerously uncertain. But fear no longer paralyzed me. It sharpened me. I started tracking things intentionally: dates, conversations, changes in behavior. I trusted my memory, but I didn't rely on it alone. I documented what I could, discreetly, carefully. I stopped sharing my thoughts. I stopped explaining my feelings. I maintained neutrality so convincingly that Daniel relaxed around me, confident I was still where he'd left me. He had no idea I'd already left the version of myself he believed he was dealing with. Once I understood that the ending had already been written without my input, I stopped trying to rewrite it. I started reading the fine print instead, and the more I read, the clearer it became. They thought they were preparing to remove me from their future. They didn't realize I was preparing to understand it well enough to survive what came next. My first instinct was to confront him. The urge hit hard and fast, rising in my chest every time Daniel spoke to me like nothing had changed. Every normal sentence felt like an insult. Every casual touch made my skin prickle. I wanted to demand answers, to force him to look at me and admit what he was doing. But instinct isn't strategy. I knew the moment I opened my mouth, everything would shift. He would become careful. Elena would disappear from view. His family would close ranks even tighter. Whatever plan they were executing would go underground, where I'd never see it clearly again. And worse, I would become exactly who they already believed I was: emotional, reactive, unstable. So I stayed quiet. Not the passive quiet I'd practiced for years, but a deliberate one. I spoke less and listened more. I stopped filling silences. I stopped explaining my reactions. When Daniel asked if I was okay, I smiled and said I was tired. That answer satisfied him more than any truth ever had. I began watching instead of asking. Who spoke first in decisions? Who deferred to whom? How information moved through the house. I noticed how Daniel phrased things when he thought I wasn't paying attention, how his confidence sharpened when he believed I was still in the dark. The restraint was exhausting. I grieved in private, late at night, staring at the ceiling while Daniel slept beside me. I let the pain pass through me without letting it spill out where it could be used against me. I kept reminding myself of one thing. I wasn't imagining this anymore. The first person to confirm that wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Elena. It wasn't anyone in his family. It was Marcus. Marcus worked in risk management and compliance, a professional connection from years earlier that I'd stayed loosely in touch with. We ran into each other by chance at a networking event I almost didn't attend. I mentioned my situation casually, without details, without accusation. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he didn't rush to reassure me. He didn't tell me I was overthinking. He didn't suggest couples counseling or communication workshops. He asked one question. Are decisions being made without your consent or just without your presence? I opened my mouth to answer and couldn't, because the truth was, I didn't know. That distinction matters, he said quietly. One is a relationship problem, the other is a power problem. The words landed harder than anything Daniel had said in months. We talked longer than I expected. Marcus didn't dramatize what I described. He stripped it down, reframed it. He talked about patterns he'd seen professionally, situations where one party managed exits while the other stayed focused on harmony. This doesn't sound like a marriage that's failing, he said. It sounds like one that's being managed. Hearing it out loud was like someone turning on a light in a room I'd been stumbling through for weeks. The confusion evaporated, replaced by something sharper and far more dangerous. Clarity. Marcus didn't tell me what to do. He didn't suggest revenge or confrontation. He warned me instead. If you confront now, he said, you lose leverage. People like this prepare narratives. Once you react emotionally, you confirm them. He paused, then added, "And you should be very careful with finances." That night I didn't sleep much. I replayed everything through this new lens, every reassuring phrase, every suggestion that I relax, every time I'd been told something was already handled. It all fit too well. I realized then that silence wasn't avoidance. It was protection. I committed fully to a different role. I stopped trying to be understood. I focused on understanding them. I documented quietly. I remembered exact phrasing, dates, changes in tone. I became meticulous in ways no one noticed because they didn't expect it from me. I practiced neutrality like a skill, no visible reactions, no sudden questions, no emotional shifts. I kept my voice steady and my expressions mild, and as I did, they grew more careless. Daniel relaxed around me. He stopped editing himself. Elena spoke more freely when she thought I wasn't listening. Conversations that once paused when I entered rooms now continued uninterrupted. They believed the story they'd told themselves, that I was still trying to save the marriage, that I was afraid of conflict, that I wouldn't push back until it was too late. There were moments when the urge to confront resurfaced, sharp and overwhelming, moments when I wanted to scream the truth just to hear it acknowledged. But I remembered Marcus's warning. I remembered what was at stake. This wasn't about pride. It was about survival. The loneliness of that choice surprised me. Strategic silence isolates you in ways emotional distance never does. I couldn't confide in friends. I couldn't lean on family. I carried the knowledge alone, protecting it the way you protect something fragile and irreplaceable. But something else began to happen as well. I felt myself change. I stopped shrinking. I stopped doubting my instincts. I stopped explaining away behavior that didn't make sense. I trusted myself again, quietly, without needing validation. They thought my quiet meant surrender. What it really meant was that I was finally listening. And the more I listened, the clearer it became that they were preparing for an ending they believed I wouldn't see coming. They were wrong about that too, because I wasn't unprepared. They just never bothered to ask who I had been before I learned how to be quiet. They thought they knew exactly who I was. To them, I was the quiet wife who stayed in the background, the one who handled feelings while others handled facts. The woman who nodded, adjusted, accommodated. The version of me they accepted was uncomplicated, and more importantly, unthreatening. What they never bothered to ask was why I had been so comfortable staying silent. Before I met Daniel, before I learned how useful my restraint was to other people, I had built an entire career on understanding systems that only looked simple from the outside. Compliance work isn't about rules alone. It's about patterns, about incentives, about knowing where people cut corners when they think no one is watching. I had spent years reading between lines, spotting inconsistencies, understanding how power moves quietly through paperwork and process. I just hadn't needed to use those skills inside my marriage. Until now. The realization came one evening as I sat alone at the kitchen table, reviewing a document Daniel had left open on his laptop. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't searching for proof. I was cleaning up after dinner, closing tabs the way I always did. One file name caught my attention. It was subtle, ordinary, the kind of thing most people wouldn't think twice about. But the structure was wrong. The labeling didn't match the timeline Daniel had described. A small flaw, but one that suggested a larger one beneath it. Something clicked. I wasn't unarmed. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Calm in a way that surprised me. Fear, which had been humming in the background for weeks, quieted. In its place came calculation. I didn't need to confront them. I didn't need to expose anything yet. I needed to understand it fully. Preparation began quietly. I organized information late at night when the house was asleep. I created timelines, cross-referenced dates, noted changes in language and access. I didn't take anything I shouldn't have. I didn't force my way into systems that were locked to me. I worked only with what was already visible, trusting that arrogance always leaves a trail. I regulated my reactions carefully. When Daniel spoke about plans that excluded me, I responded with mild interest. When Elena referenced decisions I hadn't been part of, I nodded as if it were expected. I let them believe nothing had changed. Their confidence grew as my preparation deepened. The more invisible I became, the more careless they were. Daniel stopped watching his words. Elena assumed familiarity gave her cover. They spoke around me, over me, as if my presence were furniture. There were moments when the risk felt too high. When I worried someone would notice how attentive I'd become, how often I remembered details others forgot. Once, Elena paused mid-sentence and looked at me strangely, as if trying to place something she couldn't quite identify. I smiled and changed the subject. Timing mattered more than speed. I understood that instinctively. One misstep could cost me everything. I practiced patience the way I once practiced restraint, deliberately and without complaint. Marcus remained a quiet presence in the background, a voice of reason I checked in with sparingly. I didn't share details. I didn't ask for instructions. I only needed confirmation that I wasn't imagining the significance of what I was seeing. "You're thinking clearly," he told me once. "That's rare in situations like this. Don't rush." I didn't. What surprised me most wasn't how capable I felt, but how natural it all was. This wasn't becoming someone new. It was returning to someone I had been before my life narrowed around Daniel's expectations. I saw now how easily people mistake silence for absence, how quickly they assume someone who doesn't assert power doesn't possess it. Daniel had never asked about my background in detail because it never served him to know it. He had built his plan on an assumption that suited him. I let him keep it. As days passed, I began to see the shape of the mistake they were making, a flaw in their approach that only existed because they believed I wouldn't notice. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't reckless, it was confident. Confidence makes people skip steps. It makes them reuse language. It makes them rely on narratives instead of verifying facts. They believed the outcome was inevitable, and inevitability breeds sloppiness. I didn't act on that realization. I simply noted it and waited. At night, when doubt tried to creep back in, I reminded myself of one simple truth. I didn't need to win loudly. I didn't need to dominate or expose or humiliate. I needed to be precise. The version of me they knew would have tried to save the marriage. The version of me they had underestimated understood that some structures can't be repaired, only exited safely. I was no longer waiting for clarity. I was waiting for the right moment. And as they continued preparing for a future without me, convinced I would fade quietly into whatever space they left behind, they never noticed what I was actually doing. They thought they were planning my removal. They didn't realize I was learning their system well enough to survive it. Well enough to recognize the moment they crossed from confidence into error. That moment was coming. And when it did, I would be ready. They grew confident in a way that was almost visible. It showed in how Daniel stopped lowering his voice when he spoke about plans that didn't include me. In how Elena spoke freely at the dinner table, referencing timelines and outcomes as if they were already settled facts. In how his family stopped watching my reactions altogether, assuming there was nothing left to monitor. Certainty does that to people. It makes them careless. I noticed the shift one evening when Daniel left a folder on the counter instead of locking it away like he usually did. It wasn't dramatic. No bold labels, just paperwork mixed in with invoices and permits, the kind of administrative clutter people stop guarding once they believe the battle is over. I wasn't looking for it, but I recognized it immediately. The mistake wasn't illegal on its own. It wasn't even obvious. It was procedural, buried in formatting and timing, the kind of thing that only matters if someone understands how the system is supposed to work. And I did. A filing date that contradicted an earlier claim. A signature applied after authority had technically shifted. A sequence that made sense only if no one questioned it. I felt no surge of triumph, no rush of adrenaline, just a quiet certainty settling into place. This was it. I didn't touch the folder. I didn't move it. I didn't take pictures right away. I let it sit exactly where it was, knowing that acting too quickly could undo everything. Instead, I watched. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated itself. Small confirmations appeared in places I wasn't supposed to notice. Language reused without thought. Explanations that assumed no one would ever line them up side by side. They were documenting their own intent, and because they believed I was uninformed, they did it openly. I kept letting them talk. That was the hardest part. Every instinct in me wanted to intervene, to ask a question that would force correction, to point out the flaw and watch them scramble. But interruption would have reset their defenses. Silence let them continue exactly as they were. So I waited. I cross-checked what I could without drawing attention. Dates aligned, gaps became visible. The inconsistency wasn't isolated. It explained earlier decisions, earlier urgency, earlier pressure to move things along without discussion. This wasn't just preparation, it was execution. The moment it became evidence was almost anticlimactic. I was standing at the sink, rinsing a glass, when Daniel mentioned a detail in passing that contradicted something he'd said weeks earlier. He didn't realize it. He didn't pause. He assumed I wasn't tracking any of it. I turned off the water and listened carefully. That was when I knew they couldn't undo it. The record was already there, layered and time-stamped. Fixing it would mean exposing it. Correcting it would require admitting the sequence had been wrong all along. They wouldn't do that. I didn't gather more. I didn't push further. At that point, collecting additional details would have increased risk without adding value. What I had was enough. Anything more would have been driven by emotion, not strategy. I shifted from observation to protection. I made sure nothing I had noted could be lost to memory or confusion. I organized it cleanly, methodically, without embellishment. No commentary, no assumptions. Just facts, aligned in the order they had created themselves. Marcus confirmed what I already knew. "That's not a gray area," he said, after I described it carefully, without names. "That's a structural failure. If it's raised, it stands." I asked him what he would do. He didn't hesitate. I'd let them finish what they started. So I did. The final test of patience came sooner than I expected. Daniel became almost relaxed, joking more, planning openly. Elena talked about the future without checking herself. His family began discussing logistics that assumed I would simply step aside. They were so sure. There were moments when my restraint felt unbearable, when the weight of everything I knew pressed against my chest and demanded release. But I held it in, reminding myself that timing was everything. I had waited this long. I could wait a little longer. What struck me most was how unnecessary cruelty becomes when people believe power is permanent. No threats, no raised voices, just quiet erasure, carried out with smiles and assumptions. They thought they were closing the case. In reality, they were signing it. By the time the court date arrived, there was nothing left for them to fix. No explanation that could resolve the inconsistency without revealing intent. No version of events that could reconcile the sequence they'd created. They had built their certainty on the belief that I wouldn't understand what I was seeing. That belief was their biggest mistake. Because I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't afraid. And I wasn't guessing. I was simply waiting for the moment when their confidence would be tested by someone who didn't care about their narrative at all. Someone who only cared whether the structure held. And it didn't. Not under scrutiny. Not under silence, not under the truth they had so carefully assumed no one would ever read the right way. The morning of the hearing was quieter than I expected. I woke before my alarm, the house still wrapped in that early gray light that makes everything feel suspended. There was no rush in my body, no frantic checking of documents or rehearsing of arguments. I showered, dressed, and moved through the familiar rooms as if it were any other weekday. I carried almost nothing with me. No thick folder, no stack of notes, just my phone, my keys, and a small bag that looked unremarkable by design. I knew how that would read to anyone watching. Unprepared, overmatched, already defeated. That was fine. Outside the courthouse, Daniel's confidence was on full display. He arrived flanked by his attorney, both of them moving with the easy assurance of men who believe the outcome is already decided. Elena walked a few steps behind them, composed and elegant, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested this was little more than a formality. His family followed, close enough to be seen, far enough to avoid scrutiny. They exchanged nods and quiet smiles, the kind shared by people who expect to celebrate later. No one looked at me for long. Inside, the seating arranged itself exactly as expected. Daniel at the center of attention, his lawyer leaning in, whispering reassurances. Elena seated where she could be seen but not questioned, her gaze steady, almost bored. I took my place without ceremony, alone. I felt the weight of the room settle quickly. Courtrooms have a way of amplifying assumptions. People arrive already cast in roles, and those roles harden with every glance. I could sense the narrative forming around me, the silent agreement about who held power here. I let it. As we waited for the judge to enter, Daniel spoke freely, his voice low but unconcerned. His lawyer laughed quietly at something he said. Elena checked her phone, then glanced at me briefly, her expression unreadable. I kept my eyes forward. The judge entered, and the room snapped into order. The atmosphere shifted instantly, confidence giving way to formality. Names were called, appearances noted. The process began the way it always does, methodical and detached. Daniel's attorney presented their case first. He spoke smoothly, confidently, weaving a narrative that sounded reasonable if you didn't know where to look. He described a marriage that had simply run its course, financial decisions made responsibly, authority exercised appropriately. I was framed as passive but cared for, informed but uninvolved. Listening to it stung, even though I'd expected it. Hearing your life summarized by someone who has never asked for your perspective does that. Still, I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. I didn't react. I let the story stand exactly as he told it. From the corner of my eye, I could see Daniel watching the judge, waiting for affirmation. His posture was relaxed, his expression confident. He had every reason to believe this was going according to plan. When his attorney finished, there was a brief pause. The judge looked down at the file again, flipping through pages slowly. The sound was louder this time, sharper, as if the room itself had gone quiet to listen. Daniel leaned back, satisfied, already moving past the moment. I knew better. I knew exactly which assumption their case was built on. I knew how much depended on that assumption holding. And I knew it wouldn't. Not under scrutiny. Still, I said nothing. Silence in that moment was not weakness. It was discipline. Every instinct to explain, to clarify, to defend had been trained out of me long ago. What remained was patience. The judge adjusted his glasses and continued reading. Seconds stretched, then more seconds. I felt the attention in the room begin to shift, subtle at first. Daniel straightened slightly, his confidence tightening at the edges. His attorney glanced down at his notes, then back up, as if checking for something he expected to see. Elena stopped tapping her foot. I remained still. I could feel the weight of dramatic irony pressing down, the strange calm that comes from knowing the room believes something that isn't true. To them, I had walked into court with nothing to show, no leverage, no strategy, no power. They couldn't see what wasn't being performed. The judge finally looked up, not at Daniel, not at his attorney, at me. It was a brief glance, neutral and unreadable, but it landed with quiet force. I met it without flinching, without anticipation. I didn't nod or smile or prepare to speak. I waited. Because I knew the turning point wouldn't come from an argument. It wouldn't come from emotion or accusation or persuasion. It would come from a question. One question, asked at the wrong moment, aimed at the wrong assumption. Daniel shifted beside his attorney, still confident, still convinced this was a formality on its way to completion. Elena leaned back in her chair, her expression smoothing into something close to relief. The room believed the case was over. I knew it wasn't. What they had built their certainty on was about to be examined by someone who didn't care about their confidence, their coordination, or their version of events. Someone who cared only about whether the structure held up under the rules that governed it. I felt no urge to speak, no desire to intervene. The most dangerous thing I could do in that moment was disrupt what was about to happen. They believed silence meant I had nothing. They were about to learn the difference between nothing and everything. The judge didn't begin where anyone expected him to. Instead of addressing Daniel's attorney or summarizing what had just been presented, he leaned back slightly in his chair, adjusted his glasses, and flipped to a page deep inside the file. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, the kind that signals interest rather than routine. Then he asked a question. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was technical, calm, and precise. A clarification about timing, about authority, about when a particular action had been taken in relation to another. The room froze. Daniel's attorney opened his mouth, then closed it again. He glanced down at his notes, flipping pages too quickly, as if the answer should have been there already. Daniel leaned forward, the easy confidence in his posture giving way to something tighter, more alert. Elena stopped smiling. The judge waited. When the attorney finally responded, his answer was polished but incomplete. He tried to redirect, reframing the question as irrelevant to the broader narrative. He spoke faster now, the smoothness just beginning to fray at the edges. The judge didn't interrupt him. He simply listened, his expression unchanged. When the attorney finished, the judge asked the question again, this time more directly. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quiet but unmistakable. Daniel's hand clenched briefly on the armrest of his chair. Elena shifted beside him, her composure slipping for the first time since she'd entered the room. I felt something settle fully inside me. This was it. The flaw they had assumed no one would notice had been seen immediately, not by me, not by emotion or accusation, by procedure. The judge began outlining the inconsistency step by step, as if teaching a lesson. He referenced dates, filings, and authority thresholds with clinical precision. Each point landed cleanly, impossible to argue without unraveling the entire structure of Daniel's case. The attorney attempted to explain again, this time more defensively. He suggested interpretations, context, intent. The judge raised a hand. "This is not a matter of interpretation," he said evenly. "It's a matter of sequence." The word sequence hung in the air like a verdict waiting to happen. Daniel's posture changed completely now. The confidence he'd carried into the room drained away, replaced by something brittle and strained. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering urgently, his voice sharp enough that I could hear fragments. Elena stared straight ahead, her jaw set, her earlier certainty gone. The judge turned a page. "Based on the timeline presented," he continued, "there appears to be an assumption of authority that did not exist at the time these actions were taken." Silence. I had never heard a room go that quiet. The judge's eyes lifted, and for the first time since the hearing began, he addressed me directly. "Mrs. Harris," he said. Every head in the room turned. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady, calm, unremarkable. He asked me a single question, a factual one, no accusation, no emotion, just confirmation. I answered simply, briefly. I didn't argue. I didn't explain beyond what was asked. I didn't look at Daniel or Elena or anyone else. That was all it took. The judge nodded once, as if a final piece had clicked into place. He turned back to Daniel's attorney, his tone firm now, no longer exploratory. "Given this information," he said, "the court cannot proceed under the assumptions presented." Daniel's attorney stood abruptly, attempting to interject, but the judge held up a hand again. "I'm issuing immediate orders," he said, "effective today." The words landed like a physical blow. He outlined them clearly. Measures designed to preserve balance, to prevent further action, to halt any attempt to finalize what had been prematurely assumed. The authority in his voice left no room for debate. Daniel stared at the bench, his face pale, the reality of the moment finally reaching him. Elena leaned back in her chair, her hands gripping the edges, uncertainty etched into every line of her posture. This wasn't the ending they'd planned. This wasn't loud justice. There was no gavel slam, no raised voice, no dramatic speech. It was procedural, undeniable, devastating in its simplicity. The judge concluded his remarks and glanced down at the file once more, as if confirming something only he could see. "We'll reconvene once these matters are addressed," he said. "Until then, these orders stand." He rose, and the bailiff called the session to a close. The room erupted in low voices and frantic movement. Daniel's attorney immediately began speaking in urgent whispers. Daniel shook his head slightly, disbelief giving way to anger, then to something darker I couldn't quite name. Elena didn't look at him. She didn't look at me. She simply sat there, still, as if the floor beneath her had shifted and she wasn't sure where to place her feet. I remained seated for a moment longer, letting the weight of what had just happened settle. I felt no rush of triumph, no satisfaction, only a deep, steady sense of finality. As I stood to leave, Daniel finally looked at me. There was no accusation in his eyes now, no condescension. Only the stunned realization that the version of me he had planned around had never actually existed. I didn't meet his gaze for long. I didn't need to. They had thought the judge would confirm their victory. Instead, he had confirmed what they had tried so carefully to erase. And as I walked out of that courtroom, I knew this wasn't just a pause in their plan. It was the moment it collapsed. I walked out of the courtroom without anyone stopping me. The hallway outside buzzed with low voices and hurried footsteps, but none of it touched me. Daniel stayed behind, surrounded by his attorney and a cluster of family members who suddenly looked unsure where to stand. Elena lingered near the door, hesitating, her confidence finally stripped away now that there was no script telling her what came next. I didn't look back. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because the direction had changed. For months, my life had felt like it was narrowing, options closing one by one while decisions were made without me. That morning, for the first time in a long while, the path forward was no longer being dictated by someone else. The immediate consequences came quickly. The court's orders restored balance where it had been quietly removed. Access that had been restricted was returned. Decisions that had been assumed were paused. The power to act unilaterally was gone, replaced by oversight and accountability. The shift in tone was immediate. Messages that once came with confidence now arrived carefully worded. Conversations that had excluded me suddenly required my presence. People who had dismissed my concerns weeks earlier now avoided meeting my eyes. Respect has a way of appearing when leverage changes. It didn't feel like victory the way people imagine it. There was no urge to celebrate, no sense of triumph. What I felt instead was a clean kind of relief, the kind that comes when you're no longer fighting to be seen. I still grieved the marriage I thought I had. That didn't disappear just because the truth surfaced. I mourned the years I'd spent believing patience would be rewarded, that silence would be understood as trust rather than permission. But I didn't grieve Daniel. The man who sat in that courtroom wasn't someone I recognized anymore, and perhaps he never had been. The betrayal hadn't destroyed me. It had clarified everything. In the weeks that followed, I began reclaiming my life in small, deliberate ways. Not dramatic gestures, not declarations, just choices made without explanation. I decided how to spend my time, who to speak to, what I would and wouldn't tolerate. I stopped cushioning other people's discomfort. I stopped softening my words to make them easier to accept. I didn't need to perform strength, I already had it. What surprised me most was how much of myself I found waiting on the other side of all that restraint. The part of me that trusted her instincts. The part that noticed patterns and believed what she saw. The part that didn't need permission to exist. Silence, I learned, can be a powerful teacher. It showed me who assumed I would never speak, who counted on my compliance, who mistook calm for compliance and patience for weakness. Being underestimated isn't just frustrating, it's dangerous, especially for the people doing the underestimating. I no longer track Daniel's life. I don't wonder what he tells people or how he explains what happened. That story is no longer mine to manage. I don't measure myself against Elena or anyone else who thought they could step into my place without consequence. I've let that go. What I walked out of that courtroom with wasn't just legal protection or restored access. It was something far more valuable. I walked out with myself. Justice didn't give me a new life. It gave me my own back, intact and unnegotiable. It reminded me that dignity doesn't come from winning loudly, but from refusing to disappear quietly. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, I want you to know this wasn't about revenge for me. It was about survival. About recognizing when silence is being used against you, and choosing, carefully, when to break it. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told not to worry while something important was being taken from you, I see you, and I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments if you feel comfortable. Sometimes telling it out loud is the first step toward reclaiming it. If this story resonated with you, stay with me. There are more stories here about quiet strength, about people who wait, watch, and choose their moment. Subscribe if you want to keep listening. And thank you for being here long enough to hear how silence, when used wisely, can turn into power.